Sarah McKenna's gun was halfway out of its holster when the bank exploded. The blast threw her backward against the hitching post as debris rained down on Main Street, chunks of wood, twisted metal, and something that might have been pieces of the vault door. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see 4 masked riders wheeling their horses in the street, canvas bags bulging with stolen money tied to their saddles. Bank robbery. In broad daylight. In her town. The leader spotted her struggling to her feet, badge glinting on her vest, and his laugh cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. "Well, boys," he called out, his voice dripping with contempt, "looks like Copper Creek sent a little girl to stop us." His men joined in the laughter, but Sarah noticed their hands stayed close to their weapons. Jokes or not, they recognized danger when they saw it, even if that danger came in a package they didn't expect. Sarah's hand found her gun grip as she steadied herself. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but her voice was rock steady when she spoke. "Drop your weapons. This is your only warning." The laughter grew louder, nastier. The leader, a scarred man with dead eyes, shifted his weight in the saddle, still chuckling. "Sheriff, is it? Hell, darling, you look like you should be teaching school, not playing lawman. Why don't you run along home before?" Sarah drew. The motion was lightning, a blur of leather and steel that ended with her Colt pointed directly at the leader's chest. The sound of the hammer cocking was loud in the sudden, deadly silence. For hardened killers stared at the young woman who had just outdrawn their leader by a margin that seemed impossible. The leader's own gun was barely halfway out of its holster, his cocky grin frozen on his face like a death mask. "You were saying?" Sarah asked pleasantly. For a heartbeat, the world hung suspended in perfect silence. For hardened outlaws stared at the young woman who had just outdrawn their leader by a margin that defied belief. Morrison's own gun was barely halfway out of its holster, his face frozen in an expression of shock that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Jesus Christ," one of the men whispered. "Did you see that?" Sarah kept her gun trained on Morrison while her eyes tracked the other 3 riders. Their horses were starting to dance nervously, sensing the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. The canvas bag of stolen money hung from Morrison's saddle horn, heavy with the life savings of half the town. "Here's how this is going to work," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "You're going to drop that bag of money. Then you're going to dismount and place your weapons on the ground. All of you. Nice and slow." Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his mask, but his pride was stronger than his common sense. "You got 1 gun, girl. We got 4. Even if you're fast, which I ain't convinced you are, you can't take all of us." "You're right," Sarah agreed amiably. "I can't take all 4 of you." She shifted her aim slightly to the left and fired. The bullet took Morrison's hat clean off his head, spinning it away into the dirt without touching a hair on his scalp. The sound of the shot was deafening in the confined space of Main Street, and Morrison's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing its rider. By the time the echoes faded, Sarah had already reloaded and was once again pointing her gun at Morrison's chest. "But I can definitely take you," she continued conversationally, as if the demonstration of marksmanship had been no more significant than swatting a fly. "And then I can take the next one, and probably the one after that before the last man gets his shot off. Question is, which one of you wants to be first?" The outlaws exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't how bank robberies were supposed to go. They were used to terrorizing shopkeepers and farmers, people who would cower and beg and hand over their money without a fight. They weren't prepared for a sheriff who could shoot the hat off a man's head from 20 yards away and act like it was just another Tuesday morning. "You're bluffing," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That was luck. Pure luck." Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. "Want to test that theory? I've got 5 more bullets, and I haven't missed a target in 3 years. Your choice." Behind the outlaws, curious faces had begun to appear in windows and doorways. Word of the confrontation was spreading through Copper Creek like wildfire, and Sarah could feel the weight of the town's attention pressing down on her shoulders. Everyone was watching to see what their young female sheriff would do when faced with her first real test. Some were probably hoping she'd succeed. Others were likely waiting for her to fail, to prove that women had no business wearing a badge. But all of them would be talking about this moment for years to come, one way or another. "Drop the money bag," Sarah ordered again, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never learned to doubt herself. "Now." Morrison's hand twitched toward his gun again, and Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. The man had experience and size and the backing of 3 other armed killers, but he also had the look of someone who was beginning to realize he'd made a serious miscalculation. "Jake," One of his companions said nervously, "Maybe we should—" "Shut up," Morrison snarled, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. He was trapped between his pride and his survival instinct, and Sarah could see the war playing out in his expression. Men like him built their reputations on intimidation and the fear they inspired in others. Being faced down by a woman, especially one young enough to be his daughter, was a humiliation that cut to the core of everything he believed about himself. But fear was stronger than pride, and the unwavering steadiness of Sarah's gun was beginning to tell. Morrison had seen enough gunfights to recognize genuine skill when he encountered it, and everything about this young sheriff screamed competence and deadly intent. "You know what I think?" Sarah said, her voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than any shout would have been. "I think you boys rode into town expecting to find some fat old sheriff who'd rather hide in his office than face 4 armed men. I think you figured you'd be long gone before anyone with the backbone to stop you showed up." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But here's the thing about expectations," she continued. "Sometimes they get you killed." The canvas bag hit the dirt with a heavy thud as Morrison finally released it, his nerve breaking under the pressure of Sarah's steady gaze and unwavering gun barrel. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held the street in frozen tension, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. "Smart choice," Sarah said approvingly. "Now the rest of you, guns on the ground. Move slow, and keep your hands where I can see them." The 3 remaining outlaws dismounted with obvious reluctance, but Sarah could see the calculation in their eyes. They weren't surrendering, they were positioning themselves for one last desperate play. Morrison remained mounted, blood from his shattered boot, heel leaving dark spots in the dust. His humiliation had crystallized into something far more dangerous than mere anger, the cold fury of a man whose entire identity had been shattered in front of witnesses. "You made a mistake, girl," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Behind him, Sarah caught a subtle hand signal passing between the outlaws. 3 fingers. 2. 1. They moved as one, Morrison drawing his backup gun while his men dove for the weapons they dropped. But Sarah was already in motion, her Colt clearing leather as the nervous outlaw's hand closed around his rifle. Her first shot took the rifle right out of his grip, spinning it away into the dirt. Her second shot splintered the wooden stock of another outlaw's gun before he could bring it to bear. The third outlaw, seeing his companions disarmed again, threw himself flat and covered his head with his hands. Morrison's backup gun was halfway raised when Sarah's next bullet shattered his wrist, sending the weapon flying. He screamed and clutched his ruined hand, finally understanding that he wasn't just outmatched, he was completely outclassed. "That's 4 shots," Morrison gasped through his pain. "You got 2 left, and there's still 3 of us." Sarah's smile was razor-sharp. "You're assuming I need more than 2. The sound of running footsteps echoed from the side streets as townspeople emerged from their hiding places, drawn by the gunfire. Doc Henderson appeared with his medical bag, followed by Martha Simmons carrying a shotgun that looked well used. "Sheriff," Martha called out, "you need any help with these gentlemen?" "I think we've reached an understanding," Sarah replied, never taking her eyes off the outlaws. "Haven't we, boys?" The nervous outlaw, Pete Colby, he'd given his name as, raised his hands higher. "Yes, ma'am. We surely have." "Good," Sarah said, beginning to reload her weapon with practiced efficiency. "Because I'd hate to have to explain to the Undertaker why I needed 4 coffins instead of 4 jail cells." Morrison watched her reload with the sick fascination of a man seeing his own death prepared. Every movement was smooth, confident, economical, the work of someone who'd performed this action thousands of times. "You can't hold us forever," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier menace. "Don't need to hold you forever," Sarah replied pleasantly. "Just long enough for the territorial marshal to arrive. Should be here in a week or 2. She holstered her weapon and gestured toward the jail. "Now, gentlemen, shall we discuss your accommodations?" The Copper Creek jail had barely settled into evening quiet when the first threat arrived. Sarah was checking the locks on the cell doors when she heard horses outside, not the casual clip-clop of a single rider, but the purposeful thunder of multiple mounts moving fast. Through the window, she could see torches flickering in the darkness, and voices carried on the night air. "Sheriff McKenna." The voice was rough, angry, backed by the confidence of numbers. "We want to talk." Sarah moved to the window, staying to one side where she couldn't be seen clearly. 7 men sat their horses in the street, faces painted orange by torchlight. She recognized most of them, ranch hands from the Barty spread, men who'd lost money in the bank Morrison had robbed. Pete Colby pressed against the bars of his cell. "Sheriff, those boys look mighty worked up." "They are," Sarah replied quietly, checking her weapons. They want to skip the trial and go straight to the hanging. Morrison laughed harshly from his cell. Told you this wasn't over, girl. Frontier justice don't wait for judges and lawyers. Sheriff, the voice called again. We know you got Morrison in there. Hand him over, and nobody gets hurt. Sarah stepped onto the porch, her hand resting casually on her gun. The 7 riders had spread out in a rough semicircle, clearly expecting trouble. Their leader was Buck Hanson, the Bar T foreman, a hard man who'd buried 3 sons in Indian raids and had little patience for legal niceties. Evening, Buck, Sarah said pleasantly. Kind of late to be visiting town. Cut the pleasantries, Sheriff, Hanson replied. We want Morrison. That bastard stole the money we needed to buy winter supplies. Because of him, families are going to go hungry. And they'll get their money back, Sarah said calmly. Soon as the circuit judge arrives and we have a proper trial. Judge could be weeks getting here, another rider called out. We ain't waiting that long. Sarah took a step forward, her movement deliberate and confident. Yes, you are. Morrison and his men are in my custody, under the protection of territorial law. Anyone who wants them will have to go through me first. The tension in the street was thick enough to cut with a knife. 7 armed men against 1 woman. The odds were clear to everyone present. But Sarah's reputation was already spreading, and these men had heard what happened to Morrison's gang earlier that day. Sheriff, Buck said carefully, we respect what you did today. Took real sand to face down 4 outlaws alone. But this is bigger than law and order. This is about survival. No, Sarah replied firmly. This is about the difference between justice and revenge. You hang Morrison tonight, and tomorrow another gang rides in to test whether Copper Creek really believes in law or just lynch law. Which do you want this town to be known for? Inside the jail, Pete Colby found himself holding his breath. He'd seen lynch mobs before, had even been part of 1 or 2 in his wilder days. Once they got their blood up, they were harder to stop than a stampede. But something about Sarah McKenna's absolute calm was affecting the mood in the street. Buck Hanson was a reasonable man under normal circumstances, and her words were giving him pause. What guarantee do we have that justice will be done? Buck asked. You have my word, Sarah said simply. And my word is backed by this. She tapped the badge on her vest. Morrison will face trial, and if he's found guilty, which he will be, he'll pay for his crimes according to law. And if he escapes? If some crooked lawyer gets him off? Sarah's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Then I'll hunt him down personally and bring him back. You can count on that. A new voice spoke from the shadows, Doc Henderson, emerging from his office across the street with his medical bag in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Buck, the doctor said quietly, I've known you for 15 years. You're a good man, a father, a pillar of this community. Don't let anger turn you into something you're not. Martha Simmons appeared beside the doctor, followed by 6 other townspeople. They weren't armed for battle, but their presence changed the dynamic in the street. This wasn't just about law enforcement anymore. It was about what kind of community Copper Creek wanted to be. The sheriff's right, Martha said firmly. We do this by the book, or we're no better than the men we're fighting against. Buck Hanson looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing friends and neighbors instead of potential obstacles. The fire was going out of his anger, replaced by something more thoughtful. All right, Sheriff, he said finally. We'll wait for the judge. But if Morrison escapes, if he hurts one more innocent person because we followed the law instead of our gut, then it's on me, Sarah said. And you have my permission to remind me of this conversation. As the riders dispersed, grumbling but no longer threatening immediate violence, Pete Colby found himself looking at Sarah with new eyes. That was well done, he said quietly. Most sheriffs would have just barricaded the door and prepared for a siege. Most sheriffs, Sarah replied, didn't learn conflict resolution from watching their father mediate disputes for 23 years. Morrison snorted from his cell. Pretty words won't save you when my friends come calling. And they will come calling. Sarah turned to face him, and something in her expression made the outlaw leader step back from the bars. Let them come, she said softly. I'll be waiting. But even as she spoke the brave words, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd managed to defuse one crisis, but Morrison was right about one thing. This was far from over. Outside, the night wind carried the sound of horses moving in the distance, and Sarah wondered how many more tests her authority would face before dawn. The wire arrived 3 days later, crackling over the telegraph lines from Silver City with news that turned Sarah's blood to ice water. Jake Morrison escaped custody during transport stop. Judge Harrison murdered. Stop Morrison last seen heading toward Copper Creek with dozen armed men. Stop advise extreme caution. Stop. Sarah read the message twice, her hands completely steady despite the implications. Judge Harrison was dead, murdered while trying to bring justice to frontier communities like Copper Creek. And Morrison, the man she'd humiliated in front of his own gang and half the town, was coming back with enough firepower to level the entire settlement. She looked up from the telegram to find Pete Colby watching her through the bars of his cell, his face grave with understanding. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Sarah folded the wire and tucked it into her vest pocket. Morrison escaped. He's coming back with friends. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the other prisoners, who had been playing cards and talking quietly, went completely still. Everyone understood what this meant. Morrison wasn't just coming back to rescue his men. He was coming back for revenge. "How many?" Pete asked. "A dozen. Maybe more." Pete whistled low. "That's a lot of guns, Sheriff." Sarah walked to the window and looked out at Main Street, where shopkeepers were closing their stores for the evening and families were heading home for supper. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that a small army of killers was riding toward their town with murder on their minds. "Sheriff," Pete said carefully, "you got any deputies? Any backup at all?" "No." Sarah's voice was calm, but Pete could hear the steel beneath it. "Just me. Against a dozen men?" One of the other prisoners, a young man named Billy who'd been mostly quiet since his arrest, spoke up for the first time. "That ain't fighting, Sheriff. That's suicide." Sarah turned back to face her prisoners, and they could see something in her eyes that made them all straighten up. It wasn't fear, it was the cold, calculating look of someone preparing for war. "You boys have a choice to make," she said quietly. "Morrison's coming for you, but he's also coming for me. And he's not the type to leave witnesses behind when he's finished. Every man, woman, and child in this town is in danger because of what happened 3 days ago." She paused, letting that sink in. "I can't force you to help," she continued, "but I can offer you a chance to do something right for once in your lives. Help me defend this town, and I'll put in a word with whatever judge replaces Harrison. Might not keep you out of prison, but it could mean the difference between 5 years and 15. Morrison's remaining gang members exchanged glances. They'd ridden with Jake long enough to know what he was capable of when his pride was wounded, and none of them had any illusions about their chances of survival if he reclaimed them. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Pete said slowly. "I'm asking you to help me turn Copper Creek into a fortress," Sarah replied. "Morrison's got numbers, but we've got position and preparation. If we're smart about it, we might just survive long enough for help to arrive. And if we say no?" Sarah's smile was grim. "Then you get to sit in these cells and wait for Morrison to decide whether he wants you alive or dead. Personally, I wouldn't bet on alive." Billy was the first to break. "I'm in," he said quickly. "Jake's crazy when he's mad, and losing face to a woman sheriff? He'll be looking to burn down half the territory." The other two prisoners nodded reluctantly. They knew Morrison better than anyone, and they understood that their former leader's humiliation had transformed him from a simple outlaw into something far more dangerous. "What about me?" Pete asked. "You trust me enough to put a gun in my hands?" Sarah studied him for a long moment. Pete Colby was a career criminal, but he was also intelligent and had shown flashes of decency during his imprisonment. More importantly, he was scared of Morrison, and fear could be a powerful motivator for doing the right thing. "I trust you to understand that your best chance of survival is to help me stop Morrison," she said finally. "Beyond that, we'll see." She unlocked the cells and watched as the 4 men stretched muscles that had been cramped by 3 days of confinement. They looked like ordinary men, tired, unshaven, wearing the rough clothes of frontier drifters. But Sarah knew that each of them had killed before, and she was betting her life on the hope that they could do it again when the cause was just. "First things first," she said, moving to the gun cabinet where the prisoners' weapons had been stored. "We need to get word to every family in town. They need to know what's coming, and they need to make a choice, fight or flee." "Most folks'll run," Pete observed. "Can't say I blame them." "Maybe," Sarah agreed. "But some will stay, and the ones who stay will fight like cornered wolves to protect their homes." She began distributing weapons, checking each gun carefully before handing it over. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but desperation sometimes made for strange allies. "Billy, you take the north end of town. Pete, you've got the south. I want everyone who's staying gathered in the church. It's the most defensible building we've got." As the men prepared to spread out across Copper Creek, Pete hesitated at the door. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "you know this is probably going to get us all killed, right?" Sarah checked her own weapons one final time, the familiar weight of her father's gun reassuring against her hip. "Probably," she agreed. "But sometimes dying for something worthwhile is better than living for nothing at all." Pete nodded slowly. "Your daddy really did raise you right, didn't he?" "He tried," Sarah said simply. "Now let's go see if his lessons were good enough to keep us alive." The next 12 hours transformed Copper Creek from a sleepy frontier town into an armed camp preparing for war. Word of Morrison's approaching revenge spread like wildfire, and families faced the hardest choice of their lives: fight or flee into the uncertain safety of the wilderness. Sarah stood in the center of Main Street as dawn broke, watching the last of the exodus. 3 wagons loaded with children and possessions rolled toward the horizon, carrying those who'd chosen survival over valor. She didn't blame them. Courage was a luxury not everyone could afford. But 60 souls remained, and those who stayed had made their choice with full knowledge of what it might cost them. Riders on the horizon. Billy Henderson called from the church bell tower, where he'd been standing watch since midnight. 3 miles out, and closing fast. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. They'd planned for this moment, but planning and facing reality were 2 different things. Around her, the defenders of Copper Creek took their positions with grim efficiency. Men behind overturned wagons, women in second-story windows, children safely hidden in the church basement. Pete Colby emerged from the general store, his arms full of ammunition boxes. "That's the last of it," he reported. "Every gun in town is loaded and ready." "How many rounds per defender?" Sarah asked, checking her own weapons one final time. 50 each, plus what's in reserve. Should be enough unless this turns into a siege." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the distant dust cloud that marked Morrison's approach. 50 rounds sounded like a lot until you considered that they were facing 14 experienced killers who'd chosen revenge over reason. "Sheriff," Martha Simmons called from her position at an upstairs window. "Something's wrong with the scout count." Sarah's blood chilled. "What do you mean?" "I can see them clearly now through the field glasses. That's not 14 riders. That's 20, maybe 25. The news rippled through the defenders like a shock wave. They'd prepared for 14 attackers, not 24. Suddenly, their carefully calculated odds had shifted dramatically against them. "Morrison must have picked up reinforcements along the way," Pete said grimly. "Word spreads fast out here about a woman sheriff in a town full of easy pickings." Sarah's mind raced through new calculations. 25 gunmen against 17 defenders, even with the advantage of position and preparation, was a losing proposition. They needed an edge, something to even the odds before the shooting started. "Change of plans," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every defender. "We're not waiting for them to attack. We're going to give them something to think about first." She turned to Billy in the bell tower. "How's your aim at long range?" "Pretty good, Sheriff." "What?" "When they get to about a quarter mile out, put a shot right between the lead riders. Don't try to hit anyone. Just let them know we're ready and waiting." "You got it." The tension in the street was thick enough to cut with a knife as the attackers drew closer. Sarah could see individual riders now, their faces grim with purpose and their weapons ready for immediate use. Morrison rode at their head, his wounded arm in a sling but his remaining hand gripping a rifle with white-knuckled determination. "Quarter mile," Billy called. His rifle cracked like thunder, the bullet kicking up dust directly in front of the lead horses. The entire group reined in sharply, hands moving to weapons as they realized they were already within range of the town's defenses. "That's far enough," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the distance. "This is your only warning. Turn around and ride away." Morrison's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Not likely, Sheriff. We came here to finish what you started." He raised his rifle and fired, the bullet whining past Sarah's ear and splintering the post behind her. It was the signal his men had been waiting for. Suddenly the air was full of lead as 25 weapons opened fire simultaneously. But the defenders were ready. Windows erupted with answering fire, and the carefully prepared crossfires that Sarah had positioned caught the attackers in a deadly web of lead. 3 saddles emptied in the first volley, and Morrison's horse reared in terror as bullets whistled around its head. "Take cover," Sarah shouted. diving behind the water trough as the street around her exploded with flying splinters and ricocheting bullets. The battle for Copper Creek had begun, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her town survived or became another cautionary tale about the price of standing up to evil. "Hold your positions," she called to her defenders. "Make every shot count." Around her, the sound of gunfire was deafening, but beneath it, she could hear something else, the voices of her people, calling encouragement to each other, sharing ammunition, refusing to break under the pressure of superior numbers. They were fighting not just for their lives, but for their right to live free from fear. And that, Sarah knew, was worth any price. His courage, but you've got something else too. Something that makes people want to follow you, want to be better than they thought they could be. He gestured toward the activity surrounding them. Ordinary citizens preparing for extraordinary danger, former outlaws working shoulder to shoulder with the law-abiding folks they'd once preyed upon. "You see this?" Pete continued. "This isn't just about survival. This is about proving that good people can stand together against the worst the world has to offer. Your daddy could keep the peace, but you're building something bigger than peace. You're building hope." Before Sarah could respond, a shout went up from the lookout post they'd established in the church bell tower. "Riders coming." 14 of them, just like the scouts said. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, children were hustled inside, and men took their positions behind barricades and in windows with the smooth efficiency of a drill they'd practiced all night. In seconds, Main Street had gone from bustling activity to eerie silence. Sarah checked her weapons one final time and took her position in the center of the street, where she'd have clear lines of fire in all directions. Pete and the other former outlaws spread out according to the plan they'd developed, each man responsible for a specific sector of the town's defenses. "Remember," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "we're not trying to wipe them out. We're trying to convince them that Copper Creek isn't worth dying for. Make every shot count, stay behind cover, and trust your neighbors to do their part." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Sarah felt the familiar calm that always settled over her in moments of crisis. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when 60 lives depended on her ability to think clearly and act decisively. "Here they come," Pete called from his position behind an overturned wagon. Sarah nodded, her hand resting easily on her gun. Jake Morrison was about to learn that some mistakes couldn't be corrected with superior numbers and bad intentions. The real fight was about to begin. Jake Morrison rode into Copper Creek like an avenging angel, his face twisted with rage and humiliation that had festered during 3 days of hard riding. The 14 men behind him were a collection of the worst the territory had to offer: killers, thieves, and sadists who'd been drawn to Morrison's promise of easy money and easier violence. They'd expected to find a town cowering in terror, citizens fleeing before their approach like sheep before wolves. Instead, they rode into what looked like a ghost town, with boarded windows staring back at them like dead eyes and an unnatural silence that set their horses dancing nervously. "Where is everybody?" one of Morrison's men muttered, his hand already reaching for his gun. "Hiding," Morrison spat, his voice carrying across the empty street. "Like the cowards they are." But Sarah could hear the uncertainty beneath his bravado. This wasn't what he'd expected, and unexpected situations made dangerous men even more dangerous. She stepped out from behind the water trough where she'd been concealed, her movement smooth and deliberate. The silver star on her vest caught the morning sunlight like a beacon, and her gun hung ready at her side. "Welcome back to Copper Creek, Morrison," she said pleasantly, as if greeting an old friend instead of a man who'd come to kill her. "I see you brought some friends." Morrison's face went purple with rage at the sight of her. "You," he snarled, his hand dropping toward his weapon. "You humiliated me in front of my own men." "No," Sarah corrected gently, "you humiliated yourself. I just gave you the rope to hang yourself with." The 14 riders spread out in a rough semicircle, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. Sarah counted weapons, noted positions, calculated angles and distances with the automatic precision her father had drilled into her during years of training. "You know why I'm here," Morrison said, his voice low and deadly. "I imagine you're here because your pride got hurt, and you think killing me will somehow restore your reputation," Sarah replied. "What you don't seem to understand is that reputation isn't something you can steal back with a gun. It's something you earn, day by day, choice by choice." Enough talking. Morrison's gun cleared leather with impressive speed, faster than most men could have matched. But Sarah was already moving. Her draw was a blur of motion that ended with Morrison staring down the barrel of her Colt before his own weapon had even cleared the holster. The familiar weight of the gun in her hand was like an extension of her own body, and the calm that settled over her was absolute. "Drop it," she said quietly. For a heartbeat, Morrison hesitated, his gun half-drawn and his face a mask of disbelief. Then his pride overruled his common sense, and he completed his draw with desperate speed. Sarah's gun spoke first. The bullet took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying into the dust. He hit the ground hard, clutching his wounded arm and cursing with creative enthusiasm. "Anyone else?" Sarah asked pleasantly, her gun now covering the remaining 13 men. That's when all hell broke loose. Morrison's gang opened fire from horseback, their shots wild but numerous enough to be dangerous. Sarah dove behind the water trough as bullets whined overhead, splinters flying from the wooden structures around her. But the outlaws had made a critical error. They'd assumed they were facing one woman alone. As soon as the shooting started, Copper Creek came alive with defensive fire from windows, doorways, and hastily constructed barricades. Pete Colby's rifle cracked from behind the overturned wagon, and one of Morrison's men tumbled from his saddle. Billy Henderson, who had proven to have an unexpected talent for marksmanship, fired from the church bell tower, his shot taking another outlaw's horse out from under him. "It's a trap," one of the gang members shouted, wheeling his horse toward the edge of town. But there was nowhere to run. The citizens of Copper Creek had positioned themselves to create crossfires that turned Main Street into a killing field. Every escape route was covered, every angle of retreat blocked by determined defenders who were fighting for their homes and families. Morrison struggled to his feet, his face pale with blood loss and fury. "Kill them all," he screamed at his remaining men. "Burn the whole damn town." But his gang was already beginning to break apart under the withering defensive fire. These were men accustomed to terrorizing helpless victims, not fighting trained opponents who shot back with deadly accuracy. 3 more saddles emptied as the townspeople's rifles found their marks, and the survivors were beginning to realize they'd ridden into a carefully prepared ambush. Sarah rose from behind the water trough and put 2 more shots into the group of riders, her aim true despite the chaos surrounding her. One man fell clutching his leg, and another's horse reared in panic, throwing its rider into the dirt. "Surrender now, and you live," Sarah called out over the gunfire. "Keep fighting, and we'll bury you in Boot Hill." Her words carried the ring of absolute authority, and several of Morrison's men began to look around desperately for a way out that didn't involve dying in the street. But Morrison himself was beyond reason. The wound in his shoulder had driven him into a berserker rage, and he pulled a second gun from his belt with his good hand. "I'll kill you myself," he roared, stumbling toward Sarah's position. "No woman makes a fool of Jake Morrison and lives to tell about it." Sarah stepped out into the open, her gun steady despite the bullets still flying around her. "Morrison, you're done. Surrender now, and I'll make sure you get proper medical attention. Go to hell." Morrison raised his gun with his offhand, the weapon wavering as he tried to aim despite his wound and rage. Sarah's third shot was her most precise yet. The bullet took Morrison's second gun cleanly out of his hand, leaving him standing empty-handed in the middle of Main Street while his remaining gang members threw down their weapons in surrender. The sudden silence that followed was almost more shocking than the gunfire had been. Morrison swayed on his feet, looking around at his defeated gang with the expression of a man who couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "It's over, Jake," Pete Colby called from his position, his rifle trained on his former leader. "You're beat fair and square." Morrison's face cycled through rage, disbelief, and finally a kind of broken despair. He'd come to Copper Creek to restore his reputation and had instead been humiliated again, this time in front of an even larger audience. "You think this is finished?" he said, his voice hoarse with pain and fury. "You think beating me here ends anything? There's 100 more where I came from, men who won't care that you're fast with a gun or that you wear a badge. They'll come for you, Sheriff. They'll keep coming until you're dead." Sarah holstered her weapon and walked toward him, her boots echoing in the sudden quiet. When she spoke, her voice was calm and sure. "Let them come," she said simply. "Copper Creek will be waiting." The aftermath of the gunfight was a study in controlled chaos. Doc Henderson moved between the wounded with practiced efficiency, treating both defenders and attackers with the same professional dedication. Martha Simmons organized the women into teams to help with bandages and water, while the men secured weapons and searched the fallen outlaws for additional threats. Sarah stood in the center of it all, watching her people, and she realized that's what they had become, truly and completely her people, worked together with the kind of unity that only came from shared danger and mutual dependence. The fight had changed something fundamental in Copper Creek, had forged bonds that wouldn't easily be broken. 8 dead, 6 wounded, 3 surrendered, Pete reported, approaching with a blood-stained bandage wrapped around his left arm. Could have been a lot worse. Sarah nodded, her eyes still scanning the street for any threats they might have missed. Our casualties? 2 wounded, none serious. Billy took a graze on his shoulder, and old Martha caught a splinter from a near miss. Both of them are already demanding to get back to their posts. Despite everything, Sarah smiled. Sounds about right. Morrison sat propped against the side of the bank, his shoulder properly bandaged but his face still twisted with pain and rage. Doc Henderson had done his job with professional competence, but it was clear that the outlaw leader's fighting days were over. The bullet had shattered bone and torn muscle in ways that would never fully heal. What do we do with him? Pete asked quietly. It was a good question, and one that went to the heart of everything Sarah had been trying to build in Copper Creek. Morrison was clearly a dangerous man who would cause more trouble if given the chance. The pragmatic solution would be to let frontier justice take its course, a quick trial and a hanging, the kind of rough justice that most frontier towns dispense to men like him. But Sarah had seen something during the fight that gave her pause. When the shooting started and Morrison's men began to fall, several of them had thrown down their weapons and surrendered rather than fight to the death. These weren't mindless killers. They were men who'd made bad choices but still retained enough humanity to choose life over a meaningless death. We do this by the book, Sarah said finally. Morrison and his surviving men get a fair trial in front of a proper judge. They'll hang if that's what the law demands, but they'll hang legally. Pete looked skeptical. You sure about that, Sheriff? Morrison's not the type to appreciate mercy. First chance he gets, he'll try to escape or hurt someone else. Maybe, Sarah admitted. But the law is the law, whether it's convenient or not. If we start bending it to suit our purposes, we're no better than the men we're fighting against. It was a choice that went to the core of who Sarah was and what she wanted Copper Creek to become. She could rule through fear and violence, using her reputation as a fast gun to keep order through intimidation. Or she could try to build something better, a community based on justice and law rather than the arbitrary whims of whoever held the most power. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I have a feeling Morrison's going to find prison a lot less appealing than the romantic outlaw life he's been living. Sometimes the worst punishment you can give a man like him is forcing him to face the consequences of his choices. As if summoned by their conversation, Morrison looked up from his position against the bank wall. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes still burned with undiminished hatred. This isn't over, girl, he said, his voice weak but venomous. You might have won today, but there's always tomorrow. And the day after that. You can't watch your back forever. Sarah walked over and crouched down beside him, close enough that their conversation couldn't be overheard by the growing crowd of curious townspeople. You know what your problem is, Morrison, she said quietly. You think this is about you and me. You think it's personal. She gestured toward the street around them, where citizens were cleaning up the debris of battle while former outlaws worked alongside them without any apparent tension. But it's not personal, she continued. It's bigger than that. You came here expecting to find the same scared, divided town you robbed a week ago. Instead, you found something you never expected, a community that was willing to stand together against a common threat. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Pretty speech. Doesn't change the fact that you're still just one woman with a fast gun. You're right, Sarah agreed. I am just one woman, but I'm not alone anymore. And that's what you'll never understand. Real strength doesn't come from the gun on your hip or the fear you can inspire in others. It comes from the people who trust you enough to stand beside you when the shooting starts. She stood up, looking down at the man who had caused so much trouble and pain. Your gang is broken, Morrison. Your reputation is destroyed. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell, thinking about how a small town and one determined sheriff brought down the great Jake Morrison. Morrison's face twisted with rage, but he was too weak to do anything more than glare. Sarah turned away from him and walked back toward Pete, who had been watching the exchange with interest. Feel better? Pete asked. Actually, yes, Sarah replied. I think I do. The sound of approaching horses made everyone in the street tense up again, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. But these riders carried a flag of truce, and Sarah could see the glint of badges on their vests even at a distance. Territorial marshals, she said with relief. Looks like word of our little party reached Silver City after all. As the federal lawmen rode into Copper Creek, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The fight was over, the town was safe, and justice would be served through proper legal channels rather than frontier vigilantism. But more importantly, she had proven something to herself and to everyone watching. The badge on her vest wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of the trust her community had placed in her, and she had shown herself worthy of that trust. Pete walked over to stand beside her as they watched the marshals take custody of Morrison and his surviving gang members. "So what happens now?" he asked. Sarah considered the question. Copper Creek would need to be rebuilt, both physically and emotionally. The bonds forged in battle would need to be strengthened through the slower work of daily cooperation and mutual respect. And she would need to continue proving, day by day, that a woman could be every bit as effective a sheriff as any man. "Now we get back to work," she said simply. "The real work of building a community where people can live without fear." And Morrison's threats? There really are more men like him out there. Sarah's hand rested comfortably on her gun, but her expression was calm and confident. "Let them come," she said. "Copper Creek will be ready." The courthouse erupted in chaos as masked gunmen burst through the windows, their weapons drawn and murder in their eyes. Judge Foster Dove behind his bench as bullets splintered the wood around him, while spectators screamed and scrambled for cover. "Nobody move," shouted the lead gunman, his face hidden behind a bandana, but his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to violence. "We came for Morrison, and we're taking him." Sarah was already in motion, her gun clearing leather as she positioned herself between the attackers and the prisoner dock where Morrison sat with his surviving gang members. Around the courtroom, federal marshals were drawing their weapons, but the attackers had chosen their moment well. Half the lawmen present were caught in crossfires with civilians in the way. "Think again," Sarah called out, her Colt trained on the lead gunman. "Morrison stays right where he is." The masked man's laugh was harsh and ugly. "You again? Thought we'd settled this back in Copper Creek, Sheriff." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the voice. Buck Hanson, the Barty foreman who'd led the lynch mob attempt weeks earlier. But this wasn't about frustrated justice anymore. This was about money. "Morrison's got friends with deep pockets," Hanson continued, his rifle now aimed at Sarah's chest. "Friends who don't like seeing their investments sitting in prison cells." Behind him, 5 more gunmen spread out through the courtroom, their weapons covering the marshals and ensuring that any rescue attempt would result in a bloodbath. They'd planned this carefully, waiting for the trial's final day when emotions would be running high and security might be distracted. "Let him go, Sheriff," Hanson said reasonably. "Nobody has to die here today." "You're wrong about that," Sarah replied quietly. "Keep this up, and a lot of people are going to die. Starting with you." Her words carried absolute conviction, and Hanson felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen what this woman could do with a gun, had witnessed her legendary speed firsthand. But he had 5 men backing him up, and she was just one person against impossible odds. "Your choice," he said, raising his rifle. That's when Pete Colby made his move. The newly sworn deputy had been sitting in the gallery, officially off duty but unwilling to miss Morrison's sentencing. As Hanson's finger tightened on the trigger, Pete launched himself over the rail, separating the seating area from the courtroom floor. His shoulder caught Hanson in the midsection, driving both men to the ground in a tangle of arms and legs. Hanson's rifle discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, and suddenly the carefully orchestrated rescue attempt descended into chaos. Sarah's gun spoke twice in rapid succession, her bullets finding 2 of Hanson's men before they could bring their weapons to bear. The federal marshals, freed from the standoff by Pete's intervention, opened fire with deadly efficiency. But Hanson wasn't finished. He rolled away from Pete's tackle and came up with a pistol in his hand, the weapon aimed directly at Sarah's head from point-blank range. "Should have minded your own business, Sheriff," he snarled. Morrison, still shackled but seeing his chance for freedom slipping away, threw himself forward in his chair. The heavy wooden seat caught Hanson in the legs, sending him stumbling just as his gun fired. The bullet went wide, and Sarah's return shot didn't. Hanson dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder. Around the courtroom, the sounds of gunfire were fading as the last of the rescue attempt was crushed by superior numbers and better positioning. "Why?" Sarah asked, standing over the wounded foreman. "You had a good life, a steady job. Why throw it all away for Morrison?" Hanson's laugh was bitter. "Good life? You think riding herd for $30 a month is a good life?" Morrison's people offered me more money than I'd see in 10 years of honest work. And now you'll spend the next 20 years breaking rocks instead of riding free, Sarah pointed out. Was it worth it? Before Hanson could answer, Morrison spoke up from his position on the floor. He's not the only one, Sheriff. There's others, men in high places who don't like the precedent you're setting. A woman sheriff, turning outlaws into deputies, making folks think the old ways don't have to stay the same. Sarah looked down at the shackled outlaw leader, seeing something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, not respect exactly, but a kind of grudging acknowledgement. What are you saying, Morrison? I'm saying you've got enemies you don't even know about yet, he replied. People who see what you've built in Copper Creek and want to burn it down before it spreads. This won't be the last attempt to break me out, and it won't be the last time they come for you. Judge Foster emerged from behind his bench, his robes torn and his dignity somewhat ruffled, but his authority intact. In that case, he said firmly, I think it's time we made some changes to Mr. Morrison's accommodations. Federal prison, maximum security, no more chances for dramatic rescues. As the prisoners were led away under heavy guard and the wounded were tended by Doc Henderson, Sarah found herself standing in the middle of a courtroom that looked like a battlefield. Bullet holes scarred the walls, overturned furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Pete approached, dabbing at a cut on his forehead with a handkerchief. Well, that was exciting, he said with characteristic understatement. This is what we signed up for, Sarah replied, but her voice carried a note of weariness that hadn't been there before. The question is, are we ready for what comes next? Through the broken courthouse windows, she could see the sun setting over Silver City, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, other towns were facing their own struggles with law and order, their own battles between the old ways and the new. And somewhere out there, Sarah McKenna's reputation was growing, carried by telegraph wires and whispered conversations, inspiring some and threatening others. The legend was spreading, and with it, the promise of change. 5 years later, the silver star of the chief territorial marshal caught the morning light as Sarah McKenna stepped off the train in Tombstone, Arizona. At 29, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she commanded, and the gun at her hip was worn with the easy familiarity of a master craftsman's tool. The telegram in her vest pocket was brief but urgent. Situation critical. Stop town council requests your immediate assistance. Stop cattle wars threatening to destroy entire territory. Stop. It was the kind of message Sarah had grown accustomed to receiving, desperate communities calling for help when local law enforcement proved inadequate to handle the threats they faced. In 5 years as chief territorial marshal, she'd mediated range wars, broken up outlaw gangs, and brought order to dozens of settlements that had teetered on the edge of chaos. But this one was different. Tombstone wasn't some backwater hamlet struggling with petty criminals. It was a major silver mining town with serious money at stake and powerful interests pulling strings behind the scenes. As Sarah walked down the main street, she could feel eyes following her progress. Word of her arrival had clearly preceded her, and the mixture of curiosity, hope, and skepticism on the faces she passed was familiar. Some people still found the idea of a female chief marshal hard to accept, but results had a way of overcoming prejudice. Marshal McKenna. A voice called from across the street, and Sarah turned to see a familiar figure approaching. Pete Colby, now wearing the badge of Tombstone's deputy sheriff and looking every inch the professional lawman he'd become. Pete, Sarah said with genuine warmth, extending her hand for a firm shake. Good to see you again. How are things in your corner of the territory? Complicated, Pete replied with a rueful smile. That's why we sent for you. The cattle barons and the miners are at each other's throats, and it's escalating faster than we can contain it. 3 dead in the last week, and both sides are bringing in gunfighters. Sarah nodded grimly. She'd seen this pattern before, economic conflicts that started with angry words and ended with blood in the streets. The key was intervention before the situation reached the point of no return. What's the local sheriff's position? Sheriff Williams is a good man, but he's caught in the middle, Pete explained as they walked toward the courthouse. Half the town council wants him to side with the mining interests. The other half is pushing for the cattle ranchers. He's trying to stay neutral, but neutrality doesn't stop bullets. They passed a group of hard-faced men lounging outside a saloon, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Sarah recognized the type, professional gunfighters, hired killers who followed trouble like vultures followed carrion. How many? She asked quietly. 12 on each side, maybe more, Pete replied. And they're not the usual drifters and saddle tramps. These are serious men with serious reputations. Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her, the mental shift from normal conversation to tactical planning that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous situations. 24 professional killers, 2 entrenched factions, and a powder keg ready to explode. It was exactly the kind of challenge she'd built her career on solving. Set up a meeting, she said. Representatives from both sides, neutral ground, tomorrow morning. And Pete. Yes, ma'am. Make sure they understand that I'm not here to take sides. I'm here to prevent a war that will hurt everyone involved. That evening, Sarah stood on the balcony of her hotel room and looked out over Tombstone's bustling streets. Somewhere down there, men were cleaning weapons and making plans for violence. Others were writing letters to families they might never see again, or drinking away their fears in saloons that would probably become battlefields before the week was out. It was a scene she'd witnessed too many times, in too many towns that had forgotten the difference between justice and vengeance. But it was also why her job mattered, why the badge she wore represented something more important than personal authority or political power. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah opened it to find a young woman in her early 20s, well-dressed, but with worry lines etched around her eyes. Marshall McKenna? I'm Rebecca Williams, the sheriff's daughter. I was hoping we could talk. Of course, Sarah said, stepping aside to let her enter. What's on your mind? It's about my father, Rebecca said, her voice tight with concern. He's a good man, but he's in an impossible position. The town council is pressuring him to choose sides, and both factions are making threats. I'm afraid he's going to get caught in the crossfire. Sarah studied the young woman's face, seeing intelligence and determination beneath the worry. What would you like me to do about it? Help him find a solution that doesn't involve bloodshed, Rebecca said simply. You have a reputation for making impossible situations work out. People listen to you. Sometimes they do, Sarah agreed. But not always, and not everyone. Some people are more interested in winning than in surviving. But you'll try. Sarah thought about Copper Creek, about the communities she'd helped build from the ashes of fear and division. She thought about Pete Colby and the other former outlaws who'd found redemption through second chances, and about the dozens of towns that had learned to solve their problems through law rather than violence. I'll try, she promised. But I'm going to need help. Starting with someone who knows this town and its people better than any outsider ever could. Rebecca's smile was bright with hope and determination. What did you have in mind? How would you feel about being my temporary deputy? Sarah asked. The job doesn't pay much, but it comes with the opportunity to save your community from tearing itself apart. The next morning, as Sarah walked into the courthouse where representatives from both factions waited with barely concealed hostility, she felt the weight of history on her shoulders. This meeting would determine whether Tombstone became another casualty of frontier violence or another example of what law and order could accomplish when good people stood together. Behind her, Rebecca Williams wore a deputy's badge with the pride of someone who had chosen to be part of the solution rather than a victim of the problem. And across the room, hardened cattle barons and mining executives were about to learn that sometimes the most effective lawmen in the territory came in a package they didn't expect. Sarah McKenna had started her career as the woman sheriff nobody wanted. Now she was the chief marshal everyone needed, proof that courage, intelligence, and an unshakable commitment to justice could triumph over any obstacle. The legend continued to grow, one saved town at a time.